You've seen the name on lumber trucks, on plywood at the hardware store, on the side of freight trains rolling through small towns across America. Weyerhaeuser. The brand is everywhere. The story behind it is not. 12.4 million acres, larger than Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, the largest private timberland owner in North America, a family name that became an empire, a company that claims to plant more trees than it cuts. But the origin story is not about planting, it's about burning. The conservation narrative is newer than you think. The company town history is darker than the brochures admit. And the forests they manage today are not the forests that made them rich. They are replacements. Industrial crops growing where thousand-year-old ecosystems used to stand. So, how does a timber company become the largest private forest owner in the world? How does it survive for more than a century while competitors fail? How does it rebrand from forest liquidator to sustainability leader? And who paid the price for that transformation? If you enjoy deep dives into the empires that shaped America and the people who built them, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments which company I should explore next. Your support makes these investigations possible. Chapter 1. The Immigrant and the Railroad Baron. Before Frederick Weyerhaeuser owned 12 million acres of forest, he was a German immigrant trying to survive in Illinois. Born in Niedersalheim, Germany in 1834, he arrived in America at age 18 with nothing. No English, no connections, no capital, just the willingness to work. He found employment at a sawmill in Rock Island, Illinois. Within a few years, he owned it. Not through inheritance or luck, through buying out a failed partner during a financial panic when no one else would take the risk. By 1860, he was 26 years old and controlled his first lumber operation. The timing was perfect. America was building itself. Railroads pushed west, cities expanded, farms spread across the prairie. All of it required lumber. Timber was the oil of the 19th century, the resource that powered expansion. And Frederick Weyerhaeuser understood something his competitors did not. The Mississippi River was not just a shipping route, it was a conveyor belt. He began buying timberland along the river in Wisconsin and Minnesota. He cut the trees in winter when the ground was frozen. He stacked the logs on riverbanks. When spring came and the ice melted, he floated millions of board feet downstream to his mills. The river did the heavy lifting. Gravity transported his product to market. The cost was minimal. The profits were enormous. By 1871, he had formed a partnership with Frederick C.A. Denkmann, his brother-in-law. Together they built an empire in the upper Mississippi Valley. But they were not logging sustainably. They were liquidating, cutting everything, moving on. By the 1890s, the accessible forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota were nearly gone. Weyerhaeuser needed new territory. He found it through a railroad baron named James J. Hill. Hill had built the Great Northern Railway from St. Paul to Seattle. The federal government had granted Hill's railroad company alternating sections of land along the route. Checkerboard ownership, every other square mile for hundreds of miles, 900,000 acres of dense Pacific Northwest forest. Hill did not want to be in the timber business. He wanted to build trains. He needed cash. Weyerhaeuser needed trees. In January 1900, Weyerhaeuser and 15 partners purchased 900,000 acres of Washington state timberland from Hill's Railroad Company for $5.4 million. $6 per acre. At the time, it was the largest private land transaction in American history. Newspaper headlines called it the Timber Trust. Critics accused him of monopolizing the nation's forests. Weyerhaeuser denied the accusations. But he did not deny the scale. 900,000 acres. Let that number settle. That is larger than the state of Rhode Island, larger than 1,400 square miles of continuous forest. Douglas fir, western red cedar, Sitka spruce. Trees 500 to 1,000 years old. Trunks 10 feet in diameter. Canopies that blocked the sun. These were not tree farms. They were ecosystems that had existed since before Columbus reached America. Weyerhaeuser had secured the foundation of his Western Empire. He moved his headquarters to St. Paul, Minnesota. He began assembling the infrastructure to log the Pacific Northwest at industrial scale. Railroads into the mountains, mills near deep water ports, a supply chain designed to move ancient trees from forest to market as quickly as possible. He was 66 years old. Most men his age were retiring. Weyerhaeuser was building the largest timber operation in the world. And then the forests started burning. But the fire did not destroy his empire. It built it. Chapter 2. The Fire That Made Millions. September 19, 02, Eastern Washington and Western Oregon. The air was dry. The summer had been hot. Logging operations had left slash piles and debris scattered across thousands of acres. Small fires had been burning for weeks. Loggers and settlers tried to control them. They could not. On September 8th, the wind changed. The small fires merged. The Yacolt Burn began. It would become one of the deadliest wildfires in American history. The fire moved faster than anyone anticipated. 50 miles per hour winds pushed walls of flame across the landscape. Entire towns evacuated. Some did not evacuate in time. Survivors described the sky turning black at noon. The air became unbreathable. Animals fled alongside people. 38 people died. Some estimates put the number higher. The official count is incomplete because many victims were loggers and settlers living in remote camps. Their bodies were never found. When the fire finally burned out, it had consumed 238,000 acres. Hundreds of square miles of forest reduced to ash and blackened stumps. The commercial timber value was estimated in the millions. Land that had been worth $10 to $20 per acre was now considered worthless. Owners abandoned their claims. The tax rolls listed the burned acreage as total loss. Weyerhaeuser did not see a total loss. He saw an opportunity. The trees were gone, but the land remained. And land that no one else wanted was land that could be purchased for almost nothing. Over the following years, Weyerhaeuser and his partners quietly bought up tens of thousands of acres of burned timberland, 50 cents per acre, $1 per acre, prices that would have been unthinkable before the fire. The critics called it disaster capitalism, profiting from tragedy, buying land from desperate sellers who had lost everything. Weyerhaeuser called it business. He was not responsible for the fire. He was simply responding to market conditions, and he had a plan that no one else in the timber industry was pursuing. He would replant the burned land. He would turn natural forests into tree farms. This was revolutionary. In 1900, American timber companies did not plant trees. They cut them. They moved on. Reforestation was something that happened naturally over decades or centuries. It was not a business strategy, but Weyerhaeuser had done the math. The soil was intact. The rainfall was reliable. If he could replant burned acreage with fast-growing species and harvest them on a rotation schedule, he could create a perpetual timber supply, an industrial forest. The Yacolt Burn gave him the land to test the theory. By the 1920s, Weyerhaeuser was operating tree nurseries producing millions of seedlings annually. He was planting Douglas fir in rows like corn, spacing them for maximum growth, thinning them like crops. This was not forestry in the traditional sense. It was agriculture. And it worked. The burned land that Weyerhaeuser bought for pennies in the 1900s was producing harvestable timber by the 1930s. The company that had built its fortune liquidating old-growth forests was now pioneering sustained-yield forestry. Not because it was ethical, because it was profitable, because the old growth was running out, and because fire had given them cheap land to experiment on. But sustained yield required patience. It required decades between planting and harvest, and Weyerhaeuser needed revenue now. So, while the tree farms matured, the company kept cutting old growth, faster than ever. And to do that at scale, they needed workers, thousands of them, living in places where no towns existed. So, Weyerhaeuser built the towns. Chapter 3. The company builds your world. When a company builds your town, who do you answer to? Longview, Washington was not an accident. It was a deliberate creation. In 1921, Weyerhaeuser decided to build the most modern lumber mill in the world. They needed a city to support it, a place for workers to live, a place for families to shop and send their children to school, a place that did not yet exist. They purchased 14,000 acres of farmland along the Columbia River and hired urban planners to design a company town. Not a rough logging camp, a real city, paved streets, electric lights, a planned downtown, residential neighborhoods, parks, schools. Longview opened in 1923. Within 2 years, the population reached 10,000. By 1930, it was 14,000. Almost everyone worked for Weyerhaeuser or a business that depended on Weyerhaeuser. The company owned the housing. They rented homes to workers. The rent was deducted from paychecks. The company owned the general store. Workers bought groceries and supplies on credit. The credit was deducted from paychecks. The company built the schools. The company funded the hospital. The company laid out the streets and installed the utilities. Everything a person needed to live was provided by the same entity that employed them. This was not unique to Weyerhaeuser. Company towns were common in resource extraction industries. Coal companies built mining towns. Steel companies built mill towns. Lumber companies built logging towns. The pattern was the same. Isolated operations in remote areas required housing for workers. Companies provided housing. Housing created dependency. Dependency created control. Workers in company towns faced a simple reality. If you lost your job, you lost your home. If you complained, you risked both. If you tried to organize, the company could evict you and blacklist you from employment at every mill they operated. And Weyerhaeuser operated mills across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and eventually the South. The company's reach extended far beyond Longview. The work was dangerous. Logging in the early 20th century killed more men per capita than any other industry except mining. Falling trees, snapping cables, runaway logs, equipment failures. A moment of inattention could mean death. Workers' compensation did not exist until state laws were passed in the 1910s and 20s. Before that, if a man was injured or killed, the company had no legal obligation to support his family. The union fights were brutal. The industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies, organized lumber workers across the Pacific Northwest in the 1910s. They demanded better wages, safer conditions, and an 8-hour workday. Weyerhaeuser and other timber companies fought back. They hired strikebreakers. They fired organizers. They worked with local law enforcement to arrest union leaders. In some cases, they used violence. The Everett Massacre of 1916 was one of the deadliest labor confrontations in American history. A group of Wobblies traveling by boat to Everett, Washington to support a shingle mill strike were met by armed deputies and company guards. Shots were fired. At least 5 Union members and 2 deputies died. The exact number is disputed because some bodies were reportedly thrown overboard. The violence did not stop the organizing, but it sent a message. Challenge the timber companies at your own risk. Weyerhaeuser survived the Union battles by adapting. They raised wages. They improved safety standards. They provided housing and benefits. They made it easier to work for the company than to fight it. By the 1930s, Weyerhaeuser was known as one of the better timber employers. Not because they were altruistic, because they understood that stable workers meant stable production, and stable production meant profits. But the profits depended on one thing: timber. And by the 1940s, the old-growth forests that Weyerhaeuser had purchased from James J. Hill were nearly gone. The 1,000-year-old trees were cut. The centuries of growth were erased in decades. What remained were younger forests and the tree farms they had planted on burned land. The transition from old-growth liquidation to sustained yield forestry was not a choice. It was a necessity. But even tree farming required more land than Weyerhaeuser owned, so they cut deals with the federal government, deals that would define the company's operations for the next 50 years. Chapter 4: The Government Partnership. 500-year-old trees do not grow back in a human lifetime. By the 1930s, Weyerhaeuser faced a problem. They had cut most of the accessible old growth on their private land. What remained was on steep slopes, in remote valleys, or scattered across parcels that were expensive to access. But there was another source of timber: public land. National forests managed by the United States Forest Service. After the devastating fires of the early 1900s, including the big blow-up of 1910, which killed 87 people and burned 3 million acres across Idaho and Montana, the federal government prioritized fire suppression. Smokey Bear became a national icon. The message was clear: all fires are bad. Prevent them at any cost. Suppress them immediately. This policy had consequences. Forests that had evolved with periodic low-intensity fires that cleared underbrush now accumulated decades of fuel. Snags piled up. Brush thickened. When fires eventually started, they burned hotter and more destructively than historical fires. The very policy designed to protect forests made them more vulnerable. But it also created a business opportunity. The Forest Service needed to thin overgrown stands. They needed revenue to fund fire suppression operations. They needed to demonstrate that public forests could be economically productive. The solution was timber sales. The government would auction logging rights on national forest land. Private companies would bid. The highest bidder would pay the government for the right to cut specific parcels. The money would fund forest management. The companies would get timber. Weyerhaeuser became one of the largest purchasers of federal timber. They had the capital to bid aggressively. They had the infrastructure to log remote areas. They had the political connections to influence which parcels were offered for sale. Through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, a significant portion of Weyerhaeuser's timber supply came from national forests. They were liquidating public assets with government approval. The environmental movement began questioning this arrangement in the 1960s and 70s. How much old growth should be cut? Should logging be allowed in roadless areas? What about salmon streams and wildlife habitat? The debates became legal battles. Environmental groups sued the Forest Service. Logging companies countersued. Courts issued injunctions. The spotted owl controversy of the 1980s and 90s became a symbol of the conflict between timber jobs and forest protection. Weyerhaeuser navigated these fights by diversifying. They had been buying timberland across the country since the 1950s. They owned forests in the South where trees grew faster. They owned mills that processed different species. They invested in research to make logging more efficient and reforestation more productive. By the 1990s, they were less dependent on federal timber than they had been in previous decades, but the relationship with government had been essential to their survival. There was another government partnership that proved even more valuable: tax policy. Timberland in most states is not taxed like residential or commercial real estate. It is taxed like agricultural land, with lower rates and longer assessment periods. The logic is that forests take decades to mature, so taxing them annually at full value would be unfair. As a result, timber companies pay far less property tax than other landowners with comparable acreage. Weyerhaeuser lobbied for these favorable tax treatments. They argued that sustainable forestry benefits everyone: jobs, wood products, wildlife habitat, carbon storage. They positioned themselves as stewards, not extractors, and convinced state legislatures across the country to grant preferential tax status. The savings amounted to millions of dollars annually, money that could be reinvested in land acquisition and operations. By the late 20th century, Weyerhaeuser had perfected the model: own land, plant trees, harvest trees, replant, repeat. They supplemented private timber with federal timber, minimized taxes, and maximized efficiency. It was industrial forestry at scale, and it worked. The company survived while competitors failed. It expanded while others contracted. By the year 2000, Weyerhaeuser owned approximately 6 million acres and operated across North America. But size brings scrutiny, and scrutiny forces companies to manage their reputation. That is why the company that spent a century cutting old growth became a champion of sustainable forestry. The question is whether the transformation is real or just branding. Chapter 5. The Conservation Rebrand. The same company that clear-cut old growth now advertises itself as a climate solution. Weyerhaeuser's website describes their mission as growing and sustaining forests to make life better. Their sustainability reports emphasize carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, and responsible management. They are certified by third-party forestry organizations. They participate in carbon offset programs. They donate conservation easements. On paper, they are an environmental leader. But environmentalists who work in forestry tell a different story. They point out that Weyerhaeuser's forests are not diverse ecosystems. They are monoculture plantations. Douglas fir trees planted in rows, thinned mechanically, sprayed with herbicides to control competing vegetation, and harvested on 40 to 60-year rotations. These are tree farms, not forests. The biodiversity is minimal. The ecological complexity is absent. Compare a Weyerhaeuser plantation to an old-growth forest. Old growth has multiple canopy layers, trees of different ages and species, standing dead snags that provide habitat for cavity-nesting birds, fallen logs decomposing on the forest floor, creating habitat for insects, amphibians, and fungi. Streams shaded by overhanging branches, maintaining cool water temperatures for salmon. A web of interdependencies that took centuries to develop. A plantation has rows of even-aged trees. The understory is cleared. The ground is bare or dominated by invasive species. When the trees reach harvestable size, the entire stand is cut. The soil is disturbed. The streams are exposed to sunlight. The wildlife that depended on structural complexity disappears. Within a few years, new seedlings are planted. The cycle begins again. This is efficient. This is profitable. This is not ecological forestry. Weyerhaeuser argues that tree plantations serve important functions. They produce wood products that people need. They store carbon while growing. They provide jobs. They generate tax revenue. All of this is true. But it does not make plantations equivalent to natural forests. And it does not erase the fact that the old-growth forests that once covered the Pacific Northwest are mostly gone. 95% of the original old growth has been logged, much of it by Weyerhaeuser and companies like them. The conservation easements that Weyerhaeuser donates are often marginal lands. Steep slopes that are expensive to log, riparian buffers that regulations require them to protect anyway, land that provides minimal timber value. Donating these parcels generates good publicity and tax deductions. But it does not fundamentally change the company's business model. They are still cutting trees and replanting monocultures. The carbon offset programs are similarly complicated. Weyerhaeuser sells credits to companies that want to claim carbon neutrality. The logic is that growing trees absorb carbon dioxide. Buyers pay Weyerhaeuser to maintain forests instead of cutting them. But Weyerhaeuser was already planning to maintain those forests because they are commercial timberland. The trees will eventually be harvested. The carbon will be released when the wood decomposes or is burned. Calling this a permanent carbon solution is debatable. None of this is illegal. None of it is unusual. Industrial forestry operates this way across the world. Weyerhaeuser is simply one of the largest practitioners, but the gap between their marketing and their operations is significant. They are selling a story of stewardship while running a timber factory. And the story works because most people never see a Weyerhaeuser clear-cut. They see the advertisements, they see the certifications, they see the press releases about tree planting. They do not see the industrial monocultures. The rebrand was necessary because public opinion shifted. In the 1950s, logging was progress. Jobs, economic growth, building America. By the 1990s, clear-cutting was destruction, environmental harm, loss of biodiversity, corporate greed. Weyerhaeuser needed to adapt their image to survive in a culture that valued forests for more than board feet. So they adopted the language of sustainability. They funded research. They partnered with conservation groups. They became certified. And it worked. Today, Weyerhaeuser is viewed by many as a responsible forest manager. Whether that perception matches reality depends on what you compare them to. But there is another part of the story that rarely gets discussed. The workers, the people who plant the trees, cut the trees, and operate the mills. The men and women whose labor turns forests into products. What is their story? Chapter 6. The people who make the numbers real. We have talked about Frederick Weyerhaeuser, about fire and land deals and government partnerships and rebranding. We have talked about millions of acres and billions of dollars. We have not talked enough about the people who actually do the work. The fallers who cut the trees, the equipment operators who load the logs, the mill workers who turn timber into lumber, the planters who walk miles every day putting seedlings into the ground. Modern logging is mechanized. Harvesters grip trees, cut them at the base, strip the branches, and cut them into logs in seconds. Forwarders pick up the logs and carry them to landing zones. Loaders stack them onto trucks. One crew can process more timber in a day than a team with chainsaws and cables could process in a week. Efficiency has increased dramatically, and employment has decreased accordingly. In 1950, the timber industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers across the Pacific Northwest. By 2000, the number had dropped by more than half. Automation eliminated jobs. Mill closures eliminated jobs. Federal timber restrictions eliminated jobs. Weyerhaeuser and other companies responded by increasing productivity per worker. Fewer people doing more work with better equipment. The jobs that remain are demanding. Logging is still one of the most dangerous occupations in America. Workers operate heavy machinery on steep slopes in all weather conditions. Chainsaws, falling trees, moving cables under tension. One mistake can be fatal. The injury rate is significantly higher than the national average. Despite improvements in safety equipment and training, people still die in the woods every year. The pay varies. Experienced equipment operators and fallers can earn good wages. Seasonal tree planters earn less. Mill workers earn hourly wages that have not kept pace with inflation in many regions. The timber industry is no longer the guaranteed middle-class career. It was in the mid-20th century, and the communities that depended on timber have struggled. Mill towns across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho have shrunk. Schools have closed. Businesses have shuttered. Young people have left for cities with more opportunities. Weyerhaeuser describes its workforce as skilled professionals. The company provides training and safety programs. They offer benefits. They comply with labor laws. By contemporary corporate standards, they are a responsible employer, but the scale is smaller than it used to be. The company operates with fewer people managing more land and producing more timber. The efficiency is impressive. The human cost is harder to quantify. There is also the question of contract labor. Weyerhaeuser does not directly employ all the workers who log their land. They contract with independent logging companies. These contractors hire the crews. They own the equipment. They assume the liability. If there is an accident, the contractor is responsible, not Weyerhaeuser. If there is a labor dispute, the contractor handles it. This arrangement insulates Weyerhaeuser from direct workforce management while maintaining control over operations. Tree planting is almost entirely contracted. Weyerhaeuser hires reforestation companies. These companies hire planters, often young people working seasonal jobs. The planters are paid by the tree. The more you plant, the more you earn. The work is physically exhausting. Walking miles every day through clear cuts carrying bags of seedlings. Bending thousands of times to dig holes and place trees. The weather is often cold and wet. The terrain is steep and covered with slash. Planting season lasts a few months. Then the work disappears until next year. These workers are essential to Weyerhaeuser's model. Without reforestation, sustained yield forestry does not work. But their stories are not in the company's history. Their names are not in the archives. They are line items in budgets, numbers in productivity reports. And when the automation improves, when the planting machines become more efficient, their jobs will disappear too. This is the invisible part of industrial forestry. The labor that makes the system function, but does not make it into the marketing. When Weyerhaeuser advertises that they plant more trees than they cut, they do not show the contractors in the rain putting seedlings in the ground for piece-rate wages. They show aerial footage of green plantations. The result, not the work. And yet the company could not exist without these workers. The timber would not be cut. The trees would not be planted. The mills would not run. The system depends on labor, but the value flows upward. Shareholders receive dividends. Executives receive bonuses. Contractors receive payments. Workers receive wages. Some of the wages are good. Some are adequate. Some are barely livable. The distribution follows the hierarchy. This is not unique to Weyerhaeuser. This is capitalism. Labor creates value. Capital captures value. The people at the top benefit more than the people at the bottom. Weyerhaeuser is simply a very efficient example of the system. And efficiency means maximizing output while minimizing input, including labor costs. So when the company talks about sustainability, they mean financial sustainability, sustained yield, continuous production, predictable revenue. The ecological sustainability is secondary. The worker sustainability is barely mentioned. The system is designed to produce timber and profit. Everything else is a byproduct. But systems require maintenance, and maintenance requires investment, and investment requires confidence, and confidence requires stability. What happens when a company this large faces a crisis it cannot control? The answer came in 2020. Chapter 7, The Pandemic and the Boom. 2020 was chaos. COVID-19 shut down economies across the world. Supply chains broke. Demand patterns shifted. Lumber prices spiked, then crashed, then spiked again higher than before. Weyerhaeuser navigated the volatility better than most, but the ride was wild. In March 2020, when lockdowns began, construction slowed. Builders worried that projects would be canceled. Sawmills reduced production anticipating lower demand. Lumber prices dropped. Weyerhaeuser's stock price fell. The timber industry braced for a recession. Then the opposite happened. People stuck at home started renovating. New home construction increased as buyers fled cities for suburbs. Demand for lumber exploded, but the mills had cut production. They could not ramp up fast enough. Supply could not meet demand. Prices skyrocketed. Lumber that cost $300 per thousand board feet before the pandemic reached $1,000 by May 2021. Some contracts exceeded $1,400. Weyerhaeuser's profits surged. Their 2021 annual revenue exceeded $10 billion. Net earnings were more than $2 billion. Shareholders were rewarded. The stock price doubled. For a company that had operated on modest margins for decades, the pandemic boom was a wind fare. But it did not last. By late 2022, lumber prices had crashed back below $400. The volatility was extreme. The earnings reflected it. The boom exposed something important about the timber industry. It is tied to housing. When housing starts increase, demand for lumber increases. When mortgage rates rise and housing slows, demand falls. Weyerhaeuser cannot control housing markets. They can only respond. Their sustained yield model provides a steady timber supply, but price is determined by forces beyond their control: interest rates, inflation, consumer confidence, government policy. A timber company is ultimately a BET on the economy. During the boom, Weyerhaeuser faced criticism. Builders accused them of price gouging. Homebuyers could not afford houses because lumber was too expensive. Politicians threatened investigations. Weyerhaeuser responded that they do not set prices. Markets set prices. They were simply selling timber at market rates. If demand was high and supply was constrained, prices rose. That is how markets work. The criticism persisted. The volatility also exposed the limits of tree farming. You cannot suddenly produce more timber because demand increased. Trees take decades to grow. If you cut faster than you replant, you deplete your inventory. Weyerhaeuser maintained their rotation schedules. They did not liquidate young stands to capitalize on high prices. They operated according to their sustained yield model. This was responsible forest management, but it also meant they could not fully exploit the price spike. The discipline cost them potential revenue in the short term, but preserved their long-term supply. The pandemic years also accelerated automation. Labor shortages forced companies to invest in technology. remote equipment operation, mechanized planting, digital forest management systems. Weyerhaeuser increased capital spending on equipment that reduced reliance on human workers. The efficiency gains were significant. The employment implications were predictable. Fewer jobs, higher output per worker. The trend that had been happening for decades accelerated. By 2023, the boom was over. Lumber prices stabilized at lower levels. Housing starts declined. Weyerhaeuser's earnings returned to more typical levels. The company remained profitable. The operations continued. But the pandemic was a stress test. It revealed that even a company as large and diversified as Weyerhaeuser is vulnerable to market forces it cannot control. The forests will keep growing. The demand will fluctuate. The challenge is surviving those fluctuations. And survival means adaptation. It means changing the business model when circumstances require it, which is exactly what Weyerhaeuser did in the 2010s. They spun off their real estate development and home building divisions. They sold mills and focused on timberland ownership and management. They became a real estate investment trust, a REIT, which changed their tax structure and required them to distribute most of their income to shareholders. The company that once built entire towns now focuses almost exclusively on growing and harvesting trees. Everything else is secondary. This transformation raised questions. What is Weyerhaeuser now? A timber company? A land management company? A financial vehicle for investing in forest assets? The answer is all of the above. The name is the same. The business has evolved, and the evolution is not finished. Chapter 8. The Future of Industrial Forests. Climate change is reshaping forestry. Longer fire seasons, more severe droughts, pest outbreaks. Weyerhaeuser's tree farms are not immune. Bark beetles have killed millions of trees in western forests over the past 2 decades. Fires have burned through plantations that were supposed to be harvestable in 20 years. The weather patterns that sustained yield forestry depend on are becoming less predictable. The company is adapting. They are planting species that are more drought-tolerant. They are increasing spacing to reduce competition for water. They are investing in fire prevention and rapid response capabilities. But they cannot control the climate. They can only react to it. And if conditions deteriorate significantly, the entire model of industrial forestry in the West could become unsustainable. There is also the question of carbon markets. Forests store carbon. As climate policy evolves, carbon storage may become more valuable than timber. Weyerhaeuser is already participating in carbon credit programs. They could potentially earn more from maintaining forests for carbon sequestration than from cutting them for lumber. This would fundamentally change the business model. Instead of harvesting trees, they would harvest carbon credits. The forests would still be managed, but they would be managed for a different product. Some environmentalists see this as a positive development. If carbon markets incentivize preserving forests, that is better than cutting them. But others are skeptical. They point out that carbon accounting is complicated. Permanence is difficult to guarantee, and there is a risk that carbon forestry becomes another form of greenwashing. Companies pay to offset their emissions while continuing to pollute. The forests absorb some carbon, but not enough to meaningfully address climate change. The system looks good on paper, but does not solve the underlying problem. Weyerhaeuser is positioning itself for both scenarios. They are maintaining their timber operations. They are expanding their carbon programs. They are hedging. Whichever direction policy and markets move, they intend to benefit. This is smart business. It is also a reminder that corporations prioritize profit. If carbon is profitable, they will focus on carbon. If timber is profitable, they will focus on timber. The resource is secondary. The revenue is primary. The company also faces competition from new players. Investment firms are buying timberland. Pension funds are buying timberland. Foreign investors are buying timberland. Forest assets are seen as stable long-term investments. They generate predictable returns. They appreciate in value. They provide diversification. As more capital flows into timberland investment, land prices increase. Weyerhaeuser competes with these buyers. They also sell to them. In some transactions, Weyerhaeuser has sold parcels to investment firms and then contracted to manage the land for the new owners. They profit from the sale and from the ongoing management fees. It is a clever strategy that converts assets into cash while maintaining operational control. But there is a deeper question. What is the purpose of an industrial forest? Is it to produce timber, to store carbon, to provide wildlife habitat, to generate returns for investors, to employ workers, to support rural communities? Different stakeholders have different answers, and those answers are increasingly in conflict. Weyerhaeuser says the purpose is to grow and harvest trees sustainably. That is their mission. But sustainability means different things to different people. To the company, it means sustained yield. Trees planted equal trees cut. To environmentalists, it means ecological integrity, biodiversity, complex ecosystems. To workers, it means stable jobs. To communities, it means economic vitality. To shareholders, it means reliable dividends. All of these goals are valid. Not all of them are compatible. The tension is not unique to Weyerhaeuser. It exists across the entire forestry sector, across all resource extraction industries, across the global economy. How do we balance production and preservation, profit and people, short-term gains and long-term sustainability? These are not questions that corporations are designed to answer. Corporations are designed to generate returns. Everything else is a constraint they must navigate. So, what remains? A company that has survived for more than a century. 12.4 million acres of timberland, billions of dollars in annual revenue, a workforce of thousands, a brand recognized across America, a business model that has adapted to every challenge it has faced, and a future that depends on variables no one can predict. Climate, policy, markets, technology, all of it is changing. Weyerhaeuser will change with it. They always have. Chapter 9. What the Brand Does Not Tell You. We started with a question. How does a timber company become the largest private forest owner in the world? The answer is fire, deals, government partnerships, labor control, adaptation, and survival. Frederick Weyerhaeuser saw an opportunity in burned land that no one else wanted. He bought it cheap. He replanted it. He pioneered industrial forestry. He built company towns. He secured access to federal timber. He passed the empire to his descendants. They expanded it. They modernized it. They rebranded it. They survived. But the brand story is incomplete. The Weyerhaeuser name is associated with sustainability and stewardship. The origin story is about opportunism and liquidation. The company that markets itself as a climate solution cut most of the old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. The company that donates conservation easements operates monoculture plantations. The company that employs thousands has eliminated tens of thousands of jobs through automation. All of these things are true simultaneously. The timber industry does not fit into simple narratives. It is not purely villainous. It is not purely virtuous. It is a business that produces something people need using methods that have evolved over a century. Some of those methods are better than they used to be. Some are not. The question is what we choose to see when we look at a company this large. Do we see the trees they planted or the old growth they cut? Do we see the jobs they provide or the workers they replaced with machines? Do we see the carbon they store or the ecosystems they simplified? Do we see the conservation easements they donated or the plantations they manage? All of it exists. The story you tell depends on what you emphasize. Weyerhaeuser would prefer you emphasize the sustainability, the reforestation, the certifications, the partnerships, the responsible management. And there is truth in that story. But there is also truth in the other story, the one about fire opportunism and company towns and old growth liquidation and labor exploitation and greenwashing. Both stories are real. Neither is complete. The timber industry wants you to believe that industrial forestry is environmentally neutral or even positive, that tree farms are forests, that cutting and replanting is sustainable, that corporations can be stewards. Some of this is true under certain definitions, but it requires accepting that forests are crops, that ecosystems are resources, that nature exists to serve human economic needs. If you accept those premises, industrial forestry makes sense. If you do not, it looks like organized destruction with better marketing. The legacy of Weyerhaeuser is the legacy of industrial capitalism applied to nature. Efficiency, scale, profit maximization, long-term planning, adaptation to changing conditions. All of it is impressive. All of it is ruthless. The company has survived because it treats forests as assets to be managed for maximum return. That approach has been incredibly successful financially. Whether it is successful ecologically depends on how you define success. And the workers? The people who built the company? Their stories are harder to find. The archives preserve the deals and the mergers and the financial statements. They do not preserve the daily lives of the loggers and the mill workers and the planters. Those stories exist in oral histories and union records and injury reports. They exist in the memories of families who lived in company towns. They exist in the graveyards where workers who died in logging accidents are buried. They do not exist in the corporate mythology. When a company becomes this large, it becomes a story. And stories are simplified. Heroes and villains, progress and preservation, good and bad. The reality is more complex. Weyerhaeuser is not a villain. They are a business. They do what businesses do. They identify opportunities. They manage risk. They generate returns. They survive. The consequences of their survival are distributed unequally. Some people benefit. Some people pay the cost. The forests paid. The workers paid. The communities paid. The shareholders benefited. The executives benefited. The system worked exactly as designed. So, when you see the name on a lumber truck, remember what it represents. Not just trees and timber. Fire and opportunism. Company towns and labor control. Old growth liquidation and plantation forestry. Government partnerships and tax advantages. Adaptation and survival. Wealth built on resources that belonged to everyone and ended up owned by a few. That is the story the brand does not tell. That is the story that matters. Chapter 10. The Mirror. The last chapter is not about Weyerhaeuser. It is about us. We want our stories simple. We want our heroes heroic and our villains villainous. We want companies to be either good or bad, sustainable or destructive, responsible or exploitative. But Weyerhaeuser is not simple. No empire is. Frederick Weyerhaeuser was an immigrant who built a fortune through intelligence and ruthlessness. He saw opportunities others missed. He bought burned land. He pioneered industrial forestry. He employed thousands. He cut old growth that will never return. He was both visionary and opportunist. He was both builder and destroyer. He was human. His company survived because it adapted. It survived the transition from old growth to tree farms. It survived union battles and environmental regulations. It survived market volatility and technological change. It survived by becoming whatever each era required while maintaining enough continuity to claim the legacy of what came before. That is not vision. That is survival. The conservation rebrand is not a lie. Weyerhaeuser does plant trees. They do practice sustained yield forestry. They do participate in carbon markets and conservation programs, but the rebrand is incomplete. It emphasizes certain truths while omitting others. It sells stewardship while practicing industrial agriculture. It markets forests while managing plantations. The gap between perception and reality is where the story lives. We consume the products of industrial forestry every day. The lumber in our homes, the paper in our offices, the packaging that ships our purchases, the furniture we sit on. All of it comes from trees. Most of it comes from plantations managed by companies like Weyerhaeuser. We benefit from their efficiency. We benefit from their scale. We are complicit in the system whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether industrial forestry should exist. It exists. The question is what kind of industrial forestry we want. Do we want monoculture plantations that maximize timber production at the expense of biodiversity? Or do we want more ecologically integrated systems that produce less timber but maintain more complex ecosystems? Do we want companies focused on quarterly earnings? Or do we want companies accountable to broader stakeholders, including workers and communities and future generations? These are choices. We make them through policy and regulation and consumer behavior, and we make them imperfectly because the system is complicated and the incentives are misaligned. Weyerhaeuser will continue. They will adapt to whatever comes next. Climate change, carbon markets, new technologies, new regulations. They will survive because survival is what they do. The forests will continue to grow and be cut and grow again. The workers will continue to plant and cut and process. The communities will continue to depend on timber jobs that slowly disappear. The shareholders will continue to receive dividends. The system will continue functioning, and the story will continue to be told in competing versions. One version celebrates innovation and efficiency and sustainability. Another version mourns loss and exploitation and greenwashing. Both versions are real. Neither captures the whole truth. The whole truth is that Weyerhaeuser is a mirror. It reflects industrial capitalism's relationship with nature. Extract, process, profit, replant, repeat. The efficiency is remarkable. The cost is measurable. The bill comes due over generations. And the people who pay it are rarely the people who profited. So, when you see that name, decide what you see. A sustainability leader or an industrial forest operator. A job creator or a labor minimizer, a conservation partner or a plantation manager, a timber company or a land investment vehicle. All of these descriptions are accurate. All of them are incomplete. The story you choose reveals more about you than about Weyerhaeuser. It reveals what you value, what you prioritize, what you are willing to accept in exchange for the products you consume. The poker story was a lie. The founding of the Weyerhaeuser empire was not luck or fate. It was fire and opportunism. Burned land bought cheap. Old growth cut fast. Workers controlled through company towns. Unions fought and sometimes accommodated, governments partnered and sometimes regulated, markets exploited and sometimes navigated. A century of adaptation and survival. That is the real story. Not heroic, not villainous, just relentless. And relentlessness wins. The empire continues. 12 million acres, billions in revenue, thousands of workers, a brand recognized across America, a business model that produces timber and profit and dividends, a story told in annual reports and sustainability brochures and marketing campaigns, a reality documented in clear-cuts and plantations and mechanized operations. The gap between the story and the reality is where the truth lives. And the truth is this: empires are not monuments to vision and grit. They are systems for converting resources into wealth, systems that survive by adapting to changing conditions while extracting maximum value from labor and nature. Weyerhaeuser is not unique. Weyerhaeuser is just very good at it. The question is not whether the system is moral. The question is whether it is sustainable, not financially sustainable. Weyerhaeuser has proven that tree farming can be financially sustainable, but ecologically sustainable, socially sustainable, sustainable in ways that matter to people who do not own stock. That question remains unanswered. The plantations keep growing, the timber keeps flowing, the profits keep arriving, and the old-growth forests that once covered the Pacific Northwest are gone. They are not coming back. We traded them for lumber and jobs and shareholder returns. The trade is complete. What remains is what we built on that foundation, and whether we are proud of it or ashamed of it depends on what we value more: efficiency or integrity, profit or preservation, the story we tell ourselves or the truth we are afraid to speak. If you found this story illuminating, please like and subscribe for more investigations into the empires that shaped America and the costs we rarely discuss. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you for watching.